Okay, welcome to part three, last part of this module. I want to finish up by talking about marine basins and island chains, and then sort of wrap up by talking about some of the biogeographic implications of all this. So let's talk about marine environments and island chains specifically. And epicontinental seas are something that I introduced already, but didn't really give it a definition. So these are formed when sea levels rise and oceans flood continental plates. And so you get this rise in sea level, and you get an ocean or a sea that can form over top of a continental plate. So this, if it sounds familiar, this is what we were talking about when we introduced the North American Interior Seaway. That was about 100 million to 65 million years ago, roughly, where you had that rise in sea level that formed a shallow sea over top of a continental plate. That is an example of a uh, epicontinental sea. But it's not the only place that occurred. North America wasn't the only place that occurred. So the Great Rift Valley of East Africa is the result of different movements of the African and Somalian plates. So here you have the African plate, here's the Somalian plate, and you can see that there were some subduction zones and spreading and different movements in different directions here has caused some opening up where you had so during rise in sea level and some basically an epicontinental sea that formed here. We're not really seeing that now. What we're looking at here is sort of the remnants of that and how that looks in present day and showing the direction of those continental plates. So that's just one example of that. So there are epicontinental seas that formed as sea levels changed and rose and fell throughout the history. I also want to talk more about hotspots, which were something that I introduced and didn't really define. So let's take a look at what a hotspot actually is in geologic context. Um, a hotspot is a fixed weak spot in the mantle where magma is released. As oceanic plates pass over the hotspot, volcanoes are produced, which cause the formation of islands like Hawaii. So we can get these. So here we have we're seeing these island chains going all the way up pretty much to like Siberia, the Emperor Seamounts and the Midway Islands, and then leading into the Hawaiian Islands. Basically, there are hotspots that exist in the mantle, and as these plates are sort of pushed around and they might rotate or slide over a hotspot that exists, you can get this plume of magma that forces its way through the weak spot in the mantle, and you get a formation of a volcano there. And so that's what's going on with the Hawaiian Islands, and that's very common. You know, it's the least of the formation of a number of volcanic island chains globally all over the earth. And so when we start to look at some of these chains, we see these familiar these reoccurring patterns in these different chains, and you see this sharp switch in orientation, and we see it in several island chains, and it may indicate a rigid plate moving over a stationary hotspot. So there's still some research as to what exactly is going on here. As I said, the science behind continental drift and plate tectonics is still relatively new compared to some other sciences. There's still debate about how exactly these are occurring, but I think the general consensus is that as the plates move over hotspots that might exist in various directions, the hotspots themselves are stationary, and so if the direction or orientation of the plate changes a little bit, then you're going to get a change in the shift or the orientation of the island chains themselves, because the hotspots are fixed. It's the continents, or I'm sorry, not continents, but it's the plates that are moving over top of them. In this case, it's the oceanic plate, but are moving over top of them in various directions, and that could, if you're moving, in this direction, then all of a sudden it's moving in this direction or this direction and this direction. You can get this change in the orientation of the island change, and we see it in a number of areas. Something else that has to do with marine environments is that continental drift has strongly influenced the paleo circulation and as a result, paleoclimates. And so if we look back to about 56 million years ago, give or take, we had some remnants of this Tethys seaway, which still existed. And you can see this sort of global. So first of all, there's almost like a global, there was like a global seaway around tropical latitudes, and things were circulating in this sort of longitudinal way across the surface of the Earth. But that closed off during this time period, and remnants of that sort of fed into this circular pattern of ocean currents around Antarctica and Australia. Excuse me, that we're still actually left with a little bit today. So we can still see those patterns, and that has a lot of implications, obviously, for how marine organisms can move around, but it also distributes heat and energy in different ways, and prevents mixing of ocean currents in certain things. So lots of implications there. Okay, so let's actually finish up. I want to wrap up here and talk about some of the actual large-scale global implications. We're not going to have time to dive into, every single thing that might have occurred as a result of this, because we don't even know all of that. But let's look at some of the large-scale patterns that we see. So if we look at some key tectonic events of the Cenozoic and some of their effects on the marine waters and paleocurrents. So about 15 million years ago, there was a deep water separation that resulted in the isolation of Antarctica. And this was sort of the first indications of this major global cooling that happened during this time period. And resulted in isolation of Antarctic marine biota. So if we sort of work through time here to 34 million years ago, we see major cooling and onset of widespread Antarctic glaciation. Here we have deep water connections not established and a complete isolation of Antarctic marine biota and a development of a latitudinal temperature gradient that's similar to sort of what we have today. And then if we work our way up through time, I'm going to a different location here, not through time, but to a different spatial location. We have the closure of that Tethys seaway that I was talking about. And so that's around the end of the Cretaceous, where you have this vast circumpolar equatorial tropical ocean, what was basically the Tethyan seaway. And you had major westerly flowing equatorial current system and faunal differentiation. This has implications for once that gets cut off. You can see basically that there's coral reef. First of all, there's a large-scale coral reef development that happens at this time, but basically once that Tethyan seaway is closed off by the movement of Africa and Arabia and those land masses that sort of move northward and close that off, you start to see a major differentiation, basically because you're not getting gene flow between these major across major areas. And so you cut that off, all of a sudden you have a barrier, and that caused some differentiation along different groups of organisms. Something else that's worth looking at here is that we're basically, it's interesting to look at some of the major events, geologic and sort of climatological events that correspond to some of the major mass extinction events. So if we just look at sort of the big five, the biggest mass extinction events that we know of throughout history that are in bold here, we can see some reoccurring patterns. Basically, that there are a number of events. It's not just a single thing. Usually these big ones have more than one sort of thing that's strongly linked to them. And another patterns that we see is that the marine regression and transgression tend to correspond to lots of different extinction events. So whenever you have mass changes in sea level, whether it's increasing or decreasing really rapidly, you're seeing these mass extinction events. And that should really make sense. I mean, if you have whole groups of organisms that are evolved to live in marine environments or in terrestrial environments, if you dramatically change the area that those organisms have, then you're going to probably cause a lot of them to go extinct. And so that's basically what happened. And so what you're seeing with these is just basically major changes in the sea level globally, which has quite an impact. But there's other things going on. There's global cooling, there's massive volcanic eruptions that can cause some large-scale cooling globally for short periods of time. But even though it may be a short period of time, it has a pronounced effect on the organisms that have to live through that, and they may not live through that. So lots of interesting things going on. And I think one other thing that's worth looking at is the one that happened during the Cretaceous period, where you had pretty much every, except warming, pretty much every type of major change could possibly happen. So this is one that killed off, large scale reptiles and dinosaurs and things, and pretty much anything over a certain size was pretty much obliterated or died off during this time period, because all of these things pretty much happened. So that's pretty easy to see why that's a big mass extinction event. And this is just sort of reinforcing some of that idea. So here we're looking at groups of ammonites, and basically what this pattern is you see the diversity of certain groups, specifically like ammonites, but not just them, but the diversity of them is directly related to their condition. And here we're looking at the area of Earth's epicontinental seas. So remember, epicontinental seas are like those shallow seas that form over continents with changing sea level. We can see that the area that these organisms have available to them is going to influence the biodiversity of these groups. And so basically in purple here, you're seeing the area of continents covered by sea, and that's on this y-axis, so just area, basically how much habitat do they have globally. And then you're seeing the diversity of the taxonomic groups here in these two, in the sort of the bluish and the red colors here. And basically the overall pattern is that the diversity tends to peak when the area of continents covered by seas tends to peak, and it tends to drop when the area drops. So here the sea level tends to rise, probably rose here, and so the diversity of these groups rose, and then the sea level dropped here, and the diversity dropped alongside it, and sort of a peak over here that corresponds to an increase in diversity here, and then a big drop in area corresponds to a big drop in diversity, and again a big spike and then a big drop. So you can see those corresponding, and that's indicative of a lot of different organisms, and just sort of showing how the changing sea level is going to impact how much diversity is found in some of these groups. Similarly, we have basically diversification of large groups of organisms as they become separated from one another. So seafloor spreading in the North Atlantic caused the separation and divergence of shallow water marine invertebrates. So as the North Atlantic sort of formed, it was basically just a narrow rift. And so basically the distance from one side to the other was essentially zero. So the width was zero, and then it started forming and it started separating as those ocean floor plates were pushed apart. The Atlantic Ocean formed, and basically if you were an organism on one side or the other, you got pushed apart. And what we're seeing here is the implications of that on this figure. So we have what's called the Simpson's coefficient. I'm not going to go into what that means, but like the mathematics of it, but basically it's telling you the similarity of two groups of organisms, the taxonomic similarity, like how many taxonomic groups are in both of the groups that you're looking at. And so if we're looking at two different sides of the North Atlantic, which is what we're seeing here throughout time, as the width of the Atlantic basin increased, basically as the width of the Atlantic Ocean increased, the similarity of organisms on either side of it decreased. And that would make sense because the distance between them is increasing. So you're getting differentiation that occurs here. So there's less gene flow, so things are getting less and less similar between these two groups. And this is just corresponding. I think the letters are corresponding to different time periods here, but yeah, that's what's going on there. So the differentiation as things separate apart from each other more and more. Okay, so I want to wrap this up and sort of give you a synthesis here of what we covered in this module. Our current understanding of continental drift and plate tectonics is recent and still evolving. Earth's surface is composed of plates that are in motion and land masses are dynamic. as a result, both oceanic plates and continental plates, and again, hotspots and all those things that play into that. And also these movements have important biogeographic and evolutionary implications at all scales. So at global scales all the way down to the local scale are going to be impacted over long periods of time. So that's just some main points to keep in mind from this model. Okay, so and for the last reading, there's actually not necessarily a specific reading. I'm going to give you a link to an interactive model that sort of lets you work your way through and sort of is an interactive like global model. It's almost like a Google Earth sort of thing, but you can look through time and see some of the major geologic events and what actually looked like. And I think it's probably a little bit easier to visualize than looking at static pictures on a PowerPoint. So work your way through that, explore it a little bit, and then there will be some questions that go along with it. So keep working your way through the module, and I will see you next week.